Hey there, Professor Klorman here. This video deals with sort of a grab bag of topics, different types of embellishments we've seen just a tiny bit in our analyses, but we can focus on today. And then we'll complete the spectrum of diatonic harmonies. We haven't really talked much this semester about either the 3-chord or the major 7-chord. So like in A minor, a G major chord built on the low 7th scale degree, the subtonic. Let's get started. Last week, we looked at some music by Marie Antoinette, so it's only fitting today to start with a sonata by one of the most extraordinary musicians active in Versailles during her lifetime, Joseph Bologne, Chevalier de Saint-Georges. I can only scratch the surface of his extraordinary biography, but it's worth taking a moment to give a little sketch. Today, he is recognized as the first classical composer of African ancestry. Bologne was born in the French colony of Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, the child of the wealthy French planter Georges Bologne de Saint-Georges and of his wife's Senegalese slave, Anne Nanon. Bologne's father acknowledged his son by giving him his surname and brought him to France for his education, where he ultimately became a champion fencer, a virtuoso violinist, and prolific composer both of violin music and opera, and during the French Revolution, served as a colonel in the Légion Saint-Georges, the first all-black regiment in Europe. He's known to have played on private concerts at Versailles organized by Marie Antoinette, and very possibly in these performances Her Majesty would have performed on keyboard and Bologne would have played violin. So with that image in mind, let's turn to a sonata he composed for those two instruments. This sonata overall is in the key of B-flat major, but the particular passage we're looking at is in F major. You'll notice many accidentals showing E natural. That gives us the leading tone in the key of F. So with that in mind, I've shown a little bit of analysis showing a perfect authentic cadence toward the beginning of the passage. Then I skip several measures and resume analysis toward the end. So the question as we listen is, what's going on in between in terms of the harmony? Well, if there's one thing I've tried to emphasize all semester, it's how bass lines give us a clue to the most important things going on in the harmony. And here, the bass line is holding a single note, as if an organist put their foot on the pedal F, and then perhaps was playing chords above that pedal. That's why we call these pedal points or organ points, or sometimes we simplify it to just tonic pedal. A pedal is a type of a harmonic expansion. The main harmony for the duration of that passage is an F, is a tonic harmony. But above it, there are some chords that we can recognize. So the first step to recognizing those chords is trying to figure out, in the harmonies above the pedal, which we're going to analyze separately from the pedal, which notes come together to make those surface harmonies, and which notes are embellishing tones or non-chord tones that we should disregard. I mean notes like passing tones, neighbor tones, that sort of thing. Well, starting where the violin is marked arco, the melody, la si la sol sol la fa. Perhaps we could imagine that's an embellishment of a simpler version. La sol fa. In that case, AGG seems to be an appoggiatura decorating the G. And at the end of the bar, GAF, that A seems like an échappé or escape tone. And to corroborate that, let's compare the violin's main notes to the notes in the right hand of the piano. We're going to ignore the left hand of the piano since that's the tonic pedal. We already know that. We're looking at the surface harmonies above the tonic pedal. So for instance, Where the violin's main note is G, if I combine that with the B flat and the C in the piano, that seems like a dominant seventh chord. We have C, implied E, G, B flat. In the next bar, we have F in the violin, A, C in the piano right hand. That seems like a tonic chord. And so on and so forth, and we can begin to sketch out the harmonies, the surface harmonies that are above the tonic pedal. So we end up with an analysis like I've shown here in green, alternating bars of 5, 7, and 1. Note that when we're dealing with the surface harmonies above a pedal, we don't show inversions. They don't really have inversions. They don't really have a bass note, since these surface harmonies are at the surface level. The deeper level is the tonic harmony, which stands for the tonic expansion indicated by this pedal. Let's listen to the passage once more, and we'll focus on the idea of pedal, on tonic as the main note for the duration of the pedal. One final point to make about this passage that's really a point about pedals in general. In this course, we have distinguished between two main types of harmonic progressions. Cadential progressions, where we move at a cadence from one harmonic function to another, and expansions or prolongational progressions, where we're dealing with a single harmony. A pedal, by definition, is an expansion of a single harmony, here the tonic harmony. Therefore, even though the surface harmonies go 5-7-1, 5-7-1, those are not cadences. Because at the deepest level here, it's just one expanded through the pedal. The music you see on the screen has only two cadences, where I've marked PAC. So cadence right into the pedal, and then after the pedal ends, another cadence. Both of those cadences involve bass lines of 4, 5, 5, 1 in terms of scale degrees. So subdominant, dominant, tonic, PAC. Whereas at the pedal, that's a prolongation of a single harmony, F, tonic harmony. As per usual, the bass is a real clue to what's going on in terms of the harmonic functions. So let's try out the same method in this passage from a sonata by Léopoldine Goubau d'Arvar. As you can see, the passage involves a tonic pedal. So when we analyze it, now that we've identified the main harmony, your task is to identify the surface rhythms. In other words, let's look for chords ignoring the F in the pedal. In the melody, you'll see that there are some embellishing tones, so we need to figure out which melody notes belong to the surface harmony. Let's listen to the passage, then I encourage you to pause the video and think about those surface harmonies. Well, we can already get a clue about the harmonies by thinking about the left-hand notes other than the tonic pedal. And that can give us then some help to tell which notes in the right hand belong to the surface harmonies and which ones are embellishing notes. So for instance, just looking at the left hand, it seems like some kind of tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic progression unfolds over these four measures. And if I add in thinking about the right hand, fa, mi, fa, that seems clearly to be a neighbor. The F belongs to the tonic harmony there. La, sol. In the second measure, that seems like an appoggiatura. My working hypothesis is that G, B flat, D is the chord. And at the end of the bar, sol, la, si. The G and the B flat seem to be chord tones, part of that G minor surface harmony. The A then would be an accented passing tone. The third measure, well, looking from the left hand, I'm going to ignore the F pedal, but the other notes in the left hand, C, E, B flat, That seems like dominant seventh. And the melody, mi, re, mi, the E and the C seem to be chord tones. End of the bar, do, si, sol, fa. Well, C, B flat, and G fit with that surface harmony of 5/7. The B natural in between would be a chromatic passing tone. Once again, I'll emphasize, since this whole passage is a tonic pedal, there is no cadence. Even though the surface harmonies go tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic, underneath is a tonic pedal. Therefore, this is a tonic expansion, a tonic prolongation, not a cadential progression. Published in 1905, entitled 24 Negro Melodies. Coleridge-Taylor was an English composer, a late Romantic composer English composer of mixed racial heritage, and that's perhaps what interested him in these melodies that came from the African continent. Each of these pieces, you can see there's an incipit with the tune that he used as a starting point, and what he composed is a sort of free fantasy using that tune. Now, many of the harmonies we'll see here are more chromatic than what we've studied yet in this course, more accidentals, so we won't be able to label every individual surface harmony. But we can still trace what's going on in the bass as a clue. Namely, look at the bass. G for the whole first system, G for the whole second system, and G at the beginning of the third system. That is a tonic pedal. And when the bass moves away from G, we get C, D, G. That's subdominant, dominant, tonic to help express a perfect authentic cadence. Even if we can't label every harmony above, we can still hear, feel, and understand the expansion of tonic with a tonic pedal versus the cadential progression, just from focusing on the bass. We'll hear something similar in this piece by the Brazilian composer Leopoldo Miguéz, who actually composed the music for the Brazilian national anthem. This comes from a posthumously published composition, 12 characteristic pieces, probably dating from the earliest years of the 20th century. The title is like the English word carillon, so this is a depiction of bells. And how are the bells depicted? With pedals. Imagine we have one bell, marked in green, for the note C, for the tonic, and another bell, marked in blue, for the note G. Let's listen to the passage, and I encourage you to sing along, sing do and sing sol along with the bass, so we can really hear and feel these pedals which expand the tonic harmony and then the dominant harmony. So I hope you can really hear and feel that even if we haven't labeled or even haven't yet learned how to label every surface harmony above, we can still feel that the pedal harmony is the deepest harmony, is the main harmony. We can really feel the sense of tonic, moving to dominant, and back to tonic. It's been a little while since we've analyzed a good chorale. This is chorale number 36 by J.S. Bach. I've marked a couple things for us to think about as we listen. First of all, we have some sort of passing situation in the bass in the very beginning. Sometimes when there's embellishing notes in the bass, that can be a little confusing for our harmonic analysis, so that's one thing to listen for and look out for. Secondly, take a look at the relationship between the tenor and the alto in the second measure. On the third beat, the tenor is still holding an A, so the tenor A and the alto E move down to tenor G and alto D? Is that parallel fifths? Well, no, and in fact I led you astray, because A to E is a perfect fifth, G sharp to D is a diminished fifth. That's okay, that's not parallel perfect fifths. So the issue is just whether the diminished fifth, the tritone, resolves correctly. We'll have to look out for that when we flesh out the analysis in a moment. But I'm still wondering about that A in the tenor. Why is it syncopated? Is it perhaps some kind of embellishment? Let's listen one last time, and we're going to focus on that A. Why is that A syncopated? How is it approached? How does it resolve? This is not the beginning of the chorale, so the excerpt we're looking at starts on a 4, moves to, I guess that's a 7 diminished 6. We're going to ignore the C sharp passing tone, accented passing tone in the bass. That gets us to 1, 6, which hops down in the bass to root position 1. And then the bass looks like we arrive on a 5 chord on the second quarter note. But what is going on in the tenor? We have the A held over as a syncopation, and then it moves down by step. What do we call it when there's a note that used to be part of the harmony? It's held a little too long as there's a change of harmony. That note is now dissonant, and then it goes down by step. That would be a suspension, a 4 to 3 suspension. In other words, E to A is a fourth, and when the A moves down to G sharp, that gives us a third above the bass. That's a dominant harmony, E, G sharp, B, D. So once again, we have a perfect fifth moving to a diminished fifth, but it's perfectly okay, because let's think about how that tritone resolves, the G sharp and the D. The D is the 7th of the chord, it resolves down. The G sharp is the leading tone, so it hypothetically resolves up, but since it's in an inner voice, very often the leading tone skips down to provide the 5th of the following harmony. In other words, the following harmony, A, C, E, the tenor hops down from G sharp to E to give us the 5th of that tonic chord. Harriet Abrams was well known in London as an opera singer, particularly acclaimed for her performances of Handel's music. But she was also a composer, so let's listen to a little bit of her music. Our focus today is on different types of embellishments. We've looked at pedals, we've looked at suspensions. Here, there's another kind of embellishment that we've just touched on in this course, but haven't really talked about in detail. I've already labeled the main harmonies. We have 1, going to 5, 7, going to 1. And there's some type of embellishment in the melody that you can listen for.
Must wake in remembrance to joys that I fled.
Well, those passing tones, that's child's play. That's easy for us to identify by now. But what about that D on the word R? Let's listen one more time. Is that a passing tone, neighbor tone, suspension, appoggiatura, chord tone? What's going on there?
Must wake in remembrance to joys that I fled.
Here's an idea that we've touched on in passing before, but is worth taking a moment to think a little bit about. Just as you can take a 5 triad and add a 7th to intensify, to introduce some dissonance, C, E, G becomes C, E, G, B flat, we can even add a 9th, C, E, G, B flat, D. That is what we have on the word R. The D is a chord tone. It is a dominant 9th. And it's acceptable to have that as part of the chord, just like we can have a 7th as part of a chord, provided that it resolves correctly. In this case, it resolves very much in the manner of a 7th. As we go from 5 to 1, the 7th B flat goes down to A, that's in the piano right hand, and the D, which is in the melody and in the piano right hand, goes down to C. So 7th goes down by step, also 9th goes down by step. Ninth chords become increasingly common over the course of the 19th century and into the 20th century. You can find them especially in sort of later Romantic music, in some early American pop styles. So this George Gershwin is the American Songbook that leads into jazz music. Also in French Impressionist music, and today in pop music, you hear it quite a lot. So let's listen to this passage from Cinderrelatives. And let's first of all see, can we hear the 9th? Can you spot the 9th? I haven't labeled it in the analysis, so you'll have to go looking and listening for it. And once you find it, does it resolve the same way as in the previous example?
Little Cinderrelatives.
So we found the 9th. It's indicated with the first of the 2 green arrows. That harmony is a dominant 9th chord, B flat, D, F, A flat, C. But here's the curious thing. We said before that 9ths tend to resolve in a similar way to 7ths of dominant 7th chords. But here it behaves a little differently. A 7th of a dominant 7th chord can only resolve when we change harmony. But a 9th can actually resolve within the dominant harmony, because when a 9th moves down by step, you get 8, you get an octave. So take a look here. First half of the bar, we have a dominant 9th chord. Second half of the bar, in the piano, we have C moving down to B flat. That's a 9th above the bass, moving down to an octave. That means by the end of the bar, it's no longer a dominant 9th, it's just a dominant 7th. Listen closely to that inner voice in the piano, the do, si. That represents the 9th moving down by step, resolving within the dominant harmony, so that by the end of the bar, it's just a dominant 7th, no more 9th.
Little Cinderrelatives.
Sticking with the American Songbook, we turn now to Jerome Kern. Here we have alternating 1-5-1-5. As in the previous example, the 5 chords are expressed as dominant 9ths, B flat, D, F, A flat, C. So where we have the B flat in the bass, you can see the C in the melody, that's the 9th. But the curious thing is on the 4th beat of each bar, the C seems to just evaporate, and we have just a dominant 7th. That's something we don't really have with 7ths of chords. A 7th can't evaporate. A 7th has to resolve down by step. But sometimes 9ths behave in mysterious ways. They appear, and then they disappear. Let's have a listen. Here we have a Viennese dance by Franz Schubert. I've labeled all the harmonies so you'll notice the dominant 9th chords. How did the 9ths behave in this example? Did they resolve correctly like 7ths, or did they appear and disappear like the Cheshire Cat? It seems to me we have one of each. So in the third measure of the example, the F sharp in the melody, sounds a lot like it resolves down to E one bar later. If you hear the F sharp, like it continues to ring for a whole bar, and then we can imagine it going to the E on the next downbeat. Whereas, in the last two bars of the example, we have a dominant ninth, and then on the second beat of the bar, just a dominant seventh. That's one of those disappearing, evaporating ninths. Let's listen again, and let's focus on that idea of F sharp in the melody on the first dominant ninth. Can you hear it for a whole bar resolving to E in the next bar? Over the course of this semester, we've learned to navigate increasingly challenging musical excerpts. We have here a passage from the Sarabande from Bach's English Suite No. 2, and I'd like to point out it has some chords that are pretty difficult to interpret. For instance, in the first measure, second beat, we have D, E, F, C. I don't know what kind of chord that is. Or in the third measure, second beat, we have D, A, F, C, E. Again, not really sure what to call that. I don't think Bach wrote a ninth chord there. So let's see if we can handle these complicated embellishments. Here's a clue. Sometimes we might have more than one embellishment at the same time. So to navigate a challenging score, I'm going to give you my usual advice. Focus on the bass line as a guide to identify the harmonies. That will help you tell in the right hand which notes are chord tones and which notes are embellishing. This passage may look overwhelming, but once we identify some of the suspensions, it turns out not to be so difficult. At the very beginning, E and C in the tenor and soprano parts are tied over from beat 1 to beat 2. But by beat 2, they're now dissonant notes. They're suspensions that move down by step. So the chord in beat 2 is B, D, F. 2 diminished 6. But if we want to show the suspensions in the figured bass, we can. I did here. So I showed a 9 to 8 suspension. That's the note E going to the note D, a ninth above the bass going to an octave above the bass. And we have a 7 to 6 suspension. That's C in the melody going down a step to B. So it is a 2 diminished 6 chord, but those other numbers there give a little more detail about exactly how that chord is embellished by a pair of suspensions. Going on, we have cadential 6-4 goes to 5-7, resolving deceptively to a 6 chord on the downbeat of bar 2. Notice in that 6 chord we've doubled the third of the chord, as is typical. The bass notes going on in bar 2, those are passing notes. We don't need to consider them to identify the harmony. So now I'm in bar 3. I have a 1-6 chord. Goes to this other chord that's kind of difficult on beat 2. But once we notice that the top two notes, C and E, are a restruck suspension, they move down to B and D. Those are the chord tones. So the chord on beat 2, B, D, F, A. A 2 half-diminished 6-5 chord. And once again, I've shown the suspensions in the bass, 9 to 8 and 7 to 6. That 5 is there because there's a chord tone that's a fifth above the bass. It's a 6-5 chord, embellished with a pair of suspensions. Going on to cadential 6-4, moving to root position 5, and resolving to 1. Now there's a funny thing when we land on that 1. Take a look in the top part. We have a 1 chord, A minor chord, but it has G sharp and B above it. That G sharp and B, they seem to be restruck notes held over from the preceding chord, from the previous dominant. So are those suspensions? Well, suspensions usually go down by step, but here G sharp and B go up to A and C. So we usually call upward resolving suspensions, we call them retardations. That's why I've labeled it here RET for retardation. Similar to suspensions, but they resolve up. Let's listen to the passage one more time and we'll focus on these beautiful suspensions and how they elaborate the harmonies. Now let's talk a little bit about harmony. We'll focus on a passage from the slow movement from Beethoven's 7th Symphony. The symphony is in A major, but this movement is in A minor. It begins in a wondrous way, a big chord in the winds, followed by an entrance of low strings. I've analyzed the first 4 bars of the strings to get you started. What happens to the harmony starting in the second system? We've talked in this course about almost every diatonic harmony, but we haven't spent much time on 3 and on major 7. Let's pause there for a moment to talk about each of them. First of all, 3. If I'm in A minor, 3 is C major, the relative major. And major 7, why am I saying major 7? Well, we've seen a lot of 7 diminished with a root of G sharp, the leading tone. But here we're talking about major 7 with a root of G natural, the subtonic. That's the chord you get if you use the natural minor scale, G natural instead of G sharp. So we've labeled here major 7 for the G, B, D chord going to the C, E, G chord. And in fact, it's very common to have these 2 chords in a row, major 7 followed by 3. Why do you suppose that is? Well, the reason why is because there's another way to hear these chords. When major 7 goes to 3, it can sound a little bit like 5 going to 1 in the key of C major. So imagine perhaps this passage started in the key of A minor, but we might hear it as arriving at a cadence in the key of C major. In fact, we could add one more harmony to help bolster that analysis. We have cadential 6-4 going to 5-3 and then to 1 for an imperfect authentic cadence. We're not going to focus on this in this semester, but next term you'll learn about the technique of modulation and the related technique of tonicization as a way of moving from one key to another, or starting in one key and hinting at another. So let's listen to the passage once more, and we'll focus on the idea that it starts in A minor, but by the end of it, when we hear G major chord going to C major chord, we can either think of that as 7 going to 3 in A minor, or it might really sound to you more like 5 going to 1 in the key of C major, the relative major. One last thing to touch on with this example. I mentioned the wonderful chord in the winds that opens this. It actually comes back at the very end of the movement also to round it off. That looks like a 1 chord, an A minor chord. Can you count the ledger lines? What is the bass note there? What inversion is this chord? One, 6, 4 with E in the bass. I thought we learned there is no such thing as 1, 6, 4. Well, sort of. Cadential 6-4 we've learned functions as a dominant because it's at a cadence. It's a decoration of the dominant. But here this really seems to be expressing tonic. You could almost think like it's a floating 1-6-4 waiting for the bass to enter in bar 3 to stabilize it by putting it in root position. Why do I point this out? It's quite strange in Beethoven's period and earlier to begin a piece on a 1-6-4 chord, although there are a few Beethoven pieces that do it. This is not the only one. I mentioned this to plant a seed for next week, where our topic will be different ways composers use 6-4 chords. So far, we've mostly only looked at the cadential 6-4, but we'll be talking about a couple different categories for 6-4 chords. Composers in the Baroque and Classical and early Romantic period handled 6-4 chords with care. They used them cautiously, so our topic for our final week, for week 12, will be the different ways, the different categories of 6-4 uses that you can find in 18th and early 19th century music. So once again, we have our postage stamp size portraits of the 10 composers we looked at today. A few main points to remember. Pedal points, or organ points, tonic pedals, dominant pedals, whatever they are, they expand or prolong a single main harmony. They are not cadences. So the main thing is to focus on that pedal as a chord. Above it, there are also surface chords. We can label those too, but we don't need to show inversions or figured bass, because they don't really have a bass note. The bass, the deeper level of the harmony, is the harmony prolonged by the pedal. Secondly, we talked about quartal ninths. We saw them today only on dominant chords, dominant ninths. And we can think of them as an intensifier, similar to sevenths. A 5 triad has a certain amount of intensity, but when we add a 7th, that really turns up the spice. And when we add a 9th, that turns it up even a notch higher. And lastly, 3 and major 7 chords are the rarest of the diatonic harmonies. Often, we will have major 7 pointing toward a 3 chord. That's quite common, because when we have major 7 followed by 3, it sounds a little bit like 5-1 in the relative major key. That's it for this week. Let's get ready to deal with 6-4 chords next week for our final topic this term.